Can you hear me? Thumbs up. Perfect. I just want to first congratulate you for making it to the quarterfinals, and I hope that you and your team have best of luck at your tournament this last weekend. Let's get into it. Today, I affirm the resolution that human cloning should never be allowed. Observation 1, definitions. All definitions are provided by Merriam-Webster's dictionary. Human, an individual of the genus Homo. Cloning, a production of identical units, cells, or individuals that derive from the same ancestral line. So based on this, the affirmative is defining human cloning as the production of an identical human. Contention 1, past animal cloning has been deemed unsafe. According to an article in the New York Times, in cloning, failure far exceeds its success, goes on to say that the cloning attempts done with animals, 1 in 100 have been successful and have led to thousands of abortions of cloned animal fetuses. Of those that are unsuccessful, 75% of those that are successful have a risk of a catalog of abnormalities ranging from organ deformity, premature aging, massive obesity, and damaged immune systems. Even take Dolly, the first successful cloned sheep, and see that she developed very severe arthritis within her first 2 years of being alive, 5 to 7 years earlier than that of a normal sheep. Contention 2, the cost of cloning would make the rumored medical benefits an impossibility to the average family. According to Forbes.com article, we cloned you, now here's the bill. The cost of one human cloning would cost $1.7 million from start to finish. That does not include checkups and ongoing care that would be needed throughout the life of the clone. This includes the creation and birthing process of the clone itself. This means that the ability of human cloning to be able to achieve any benefits the con might claim, they have to be able to prove how this would be financially available. The article goes on to say that even in the world where cloning is proven to solve anything, this would decrease the quality of life for those that have a cure for something and cannot financially obtain it. Contention 3, the quality of life for the clone itself. Because in birth, this clone is not an original person that is separated from individuals like everyone else, the clone will have an extra amount of stress that is not put on an individual regularly. Reproductive cloning would decrease the respect for individuals because of the feeling they are replaceable. Reproductive technology raises questions on human values, dignity, worth, judicial rights, because the person cannot be used as a mere mechanical instrument, and individuals are not repeatable units. Disruption for family relations can also become common with cloning technology. This will influence the individual sense of personal dignity. The science of cloning is inexact and is not clear how far it may cause suffering to human beings. The relationship between identity and dignity is strong. Identity may be considered from a number of different perspectives: personal, perceived, and legal. From the view of personal identity, the question arises as to whether a cloned individual will have a full sense of personal identity. Individualism is linked to the identity and plays an ever-increasing role in the concept of personal dignity.
Hi, I'm gonna, firstly, thank you very much. Congratulations yourself for making it. My team made the grand final, which was very nice. A feat I hope to replicate here. I've got one brief question that I want to ask before I get into my arguments, and that is, are you including the use of therapeutic cloning? That is to say, an attempt to duplicate parts of a human body, so for instance, organs, through the mechanisms of cloning, but never intending to create an original person, and a process that is not expected to rely on the creation of an intentional person. So there's two different things when you talk about cloning. There's attempting to clone a whole person, and there is the use of cloning technologies for therapeutic clonings to create organs that are then used for organ transplants. I just want to know if you support bans on both of those things or only on one of them.
Context of this resolution, I'm talking about human cloning, the cloning of a human, not an organ. An organ is not a human, is a part of a human, so I'm not including that in this part of the debate.
That then knocks out a lot of your arguments. The first argument that it knocks out is the idea that human cloning is deeply unsafe. Human cloning is presently unsafe, so is therapeutic cloning. The argument for therapeutic cloning is incredibly intuitive and part of ordinary medical science. That is to say, it is likely to result in an enormous improvement in quality of life because it means that we will have unlimited access to organs that are ideally suited for the person who needs an organ transplant, so you won't have things like the high rejection rates or the need to take immunosuppressant drugs when you have them. In that context, realistically, the point at which we're capable of doing that sort of cloning to a high degree of safety, and importantly, we're very likely to get there because all of the problems that you describe are not unique to cloning. They are just problems of general early stage medical development, are unlikely to be occurring when we're talking about the the cloning of a specific person. Secondly, this also knocks out your idea of costs being very high. Yes, it is true, initial stage medicine is incredibly expensive. That cost goes down when, firstly, there is a higher degree of innovation as people within the medical fields compete amongst themselves to lower the prices. And secondly, economies of scale are generated such that more people are doing it, so more efficiencies are gained. But importantly, even if the costs are high, that just means that cloning should be conceptualized of as a luxury good and not necessarily a good of any other sort. The final thing that I want to describe here is looking at your moral argument. So you claim essentially that this raises a host of questions about individual identity. My counter assertion is there are many things under the status quo that already largely resemble cloning. I am biologically a clone. That is to say, I am an identical twin. My DNA is no different to the DNA of, in fact, another QallOut user. That does not, to me, challenge my identity in any meaningful way. The only difference between the form in which I was created and the form in which another clone was created is that a person with identical DNA to myself is being created with intent instead of accidentally. Except, of course, the second analogy is that people are already created with intent all the time. Most births happen because two people decide they want to bring life into the world. So when you think about cloning, the best analogy, it is just we are allowing individuals to bring identical twins into the world. Realistically, that to me does not seem to be an ethical problem. In the second half of this split, I'm going to talk to you about why there might be a couple the final thing I want to note here is that your burden is to support a ban on cloning in all circumstances. We can still support regulations on cloning, such that in circumstances where it might be abusive, in which the quality of life for the clone might be low, or in which different experimentation still needs to be done, we can still support bans in those circumstances. You need to support the ban in literally the worst case scenario.
Okay, so let's go on. He doesn't really present his own case. He kind of just attacks mine, so we're going to go on to that itself. One, he talks about therapeutic cloning. Again, I'm not talking about therapeutic cloning because therapeutic cloning specifically is that of an organ, as he specifically says. I'm talking about the cloning of an individual as a whole. So all analysis towards therapeutic cloning doesn't apply here. But two, if you go to therapeutic cloning, we still have the cost argument that comes into play, which I'm going to get into when we still get into into his contention of that. And then he says the problem of the aggress development and how this aggresses over time. One, all of my analysis in the very first contention completely stands today. It talks about how it still happens. This has gone on for 10 years of treatment and these different things, and they still have these statistics. These statistics were from 2015. So we still see that these are not successful. So we have no successful rate of cloning, and all the cloning that happens has had abnormalities that exist. He has not been able to refute that, so we would never want to do something that has a 75% rate of an abnormality happening in a human cloning scenario. If that exists today, that's not something we should have, and that we should not exist. Two, he goes on to the cost of cloning. One, he says the initial state. First, my first argument on this is let's go to the New York Times or the Forbes.com article that I said. It said even within 50 to 100 years of research, even as this technology advanced, human cloning could no way go beyond the cost of $150,000 to $250,000 for one clone. This is still a majority of the salary that one family or household makes within the year. My second argumentation on this is going to be an article from the Chicago Tribune that talks about cancer research, and it says that 1 in 4 cancer treatment patients can't afford the proper cancer treatment that is necessary today. So when we look to even this medical benefit of cancer that has been going on for forever, we can see that the cost of that has not gone in, where 75% of the people can't afford the effective treatment and the amount of treatment they actually need. So we're going to see that this is continue to apply to human cloning when this cancer that's been going on for forever is still existing and it still hasn't gotten cheaper. So that knocks those out. 3, a luxury good that links directly into my second contention. At the point where we make it a luxury good, we're saying that only the people that can afford it get the medical benefit of it, including the organs if that's where he wants to go, including the extra child if that's where he wants to go. We get into this aspect where that happens in that terms, and we're only making it almost like a black market scenario where it goes to the highest bidder. Third, onto the quality of life contention. He uses the twin analysis. One, not all twins feel that way. His personal analysis is not the same. We looked at Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen, who said that they're not continuing to do Fuller House, the spinoff series for Netflix, because they specifically said they want their own identities and are tired of living in their sister's shadows. 2, we say that we have the intent to do that now. 1, that's not an identical twin with the identical DNA. 2, 3, we can actually raise these people as children, not a medical creation. My contention 3 also talks about how making these almost like an experiment and not an actual creation of a child.
It says on your page that you're a conservative Republican, but for a conservative Republican, you have an astonishing lack of understanding of the way in which innovation reduces costs. Your claim is essentially that some forms of medicine, for instance, cancer treatments, have not reduced over time. They haven't reduced in cost over time. They've increased in efficacy over the time, which has meant that the prices remain the same. But we have been getting better at it. And the only evidence that you're providing here is in the idea that, well, the cost is high right now. Yes, research would likely lower that. And it's important to understand then all of your harms only apply right now to cloning. We do not support attempts to clone right now. It is illegal to clone someone at the moment in all circumstances. Currently, what is happening is research into cloning, that is to say, an attempt to make it better so that we are able to do it more successfully in the future. And that means in limited context, we do things like cloning, for instance, bringing the creation of an embryo that might be cloned and then terminating it before it becomes a full human life. That's still cloning, but we think that that is an important step along the way. And the most important thing to understand here is that you need to ban research into any form of cloning, the one I just described, which is definitely a form of cloning, in order to restrict therapeutic cloning. But more importantly, in the future, given that you need to support bans on all forms of cloning, and that includes in the future when we think this technology is likely to have developed better, the existence of therapeutic cloning means that your first two contentions will not be true. It is likely that the market demands and a degree of additional research will have made it safer. It also seems likely that the costs are going to be higher. I want to make a substantive argument here, and this is about the right of individuals to make choices about their own biological matter. The state does not interfere with the ability of people to have children in any setting. The state does not limit the ability of two people with Down syndrome to have children, making a prejudgment on the life of that child in the future, nor do they do so for people that are very poor or anything like that. And that is because we recognize that one of the most important rights in the world in any context is the ability to have control of the use of your own genetic matter and the control of your choices about your ability to bring life into the world. We think then it is quite legitimate for people, beyond the question of whether or not it is a wise choice for them to do so, to choose to bring a clone into the world. If that is the mechanism upon which they want to have a child instead of the actual raising of a baby, I think that is totally acceptable. And to integrate that with the rebuttal to the things that you were saying there, this is already similar to things that already happen. We already have twins in the world. You say Mary-Kate and Ashley do not feel the same way that I do. That is because they were put in a media context in which everyone told them they were exactly the same. Parents would not do the same because they would recognize that they were different people. And of course, we allow people to already bring children into the world as the way that I've already described. So beyond anything else, I just think that this ban is immoral.
Okay, so one, cloning. Again, one, the therapeutic cloning does not apply to this scenario. I want to continue to point that out, but he's saying that because this happens, it's cheap. He says I have to ban all cloning. No, I said specifically from the beginning, I have to ban human cloning. I define human cloning in my definitions. That goes untouched. I do not have to ban therapeutic cloning. I just have to ban human cloning. So therefore, my links do still exist. Then he goes into, again, I don't see how my personal political benefits have anything to do with this specific debate, but that's fine. I mean, he says that the cost of things go down and we go into the cancer research. One that doesn't stop the statistic of 25% of the people only can afford the top of the line cancer treatment today. And this has been going on for 20 years. Therefore, that contention still completely stands. We look to this black market scenario of how we're going to the highest bidder for this to be able to happen. He says, one, in his arguments on my third contention, this quality of life contention, he talks about how we can't limit anyone to be able to do this. Here's the catch-22 he's caught himself in. One, if we say that we can't limit people to do this, then my second contention stands at the aspect of we're saying that this is a highest bidder scenario, and these poor people can't afford it. Therefore, if they want to do it and it is legal for them to do it, their quality of life, because they can't achieve their dreams, goes down. So he cannot win both of those contentions in that scenario, and we see the impacts coming off of those. One of the black market scenario, the poor class not being able to get the medical benefits that they want, and then three, the quality of life where this is going to happen. Then we go back to this twin argument. He says it's because Mary-Kate and Ashley were into the media and it was forced to them. One, this is not an identical twin. This is somebody that's actually going to happen after the fact. So it would be like you and your brother being 20 years apart or 10 years apart or 5 years apart. So you're not being raised together and born in the same aspect. You're literally living in the shadow of one another, even in the worst case than Mary-Kate and Ashley would do. Because what if you went on for 10 years and you were super, super successful, and then the clone that was 10 years later was not successful, and he's not measuring up because he's not developing, or these abnormalities that are in contention one are starting to play, that decreases the quality of life of the clone itself in that intention and in that structure. So when we look to this happening, we see specifically likely that happening. So he says that this is all for him a morality debate. The Khan specifically says that this is nothing but a morality debate to him. Well, let's look to the morality of this. One, the morality of the fact that this is actually going to decrease quality of life through abnormalities, and how 1 in 100 aren't even successful. So if they pay this money for this to happen, there's no guarantee that the clone's actually going to be successful. How does that morally okay for the family and their quality of life? Two, the normality of over 80% of our population won't be able to even have access to this because the technology still has not gotten expensive. And my Forbes article says that it would still be at least $250,000 for one clone. And then three, we looked at the quality of the life of the clone itself and how that's going to specifically happening. The negative impacts coming off of this are zero. The pro impacts that are coming off of this are great and are there. So you're going to vote at risk of solvency.
To summarize the debate so far, you misunderstand the importance of therapeutic cloning. There are two impacts here. Firstly, it is impossible to do research into therapeutic cloning without also doing research, which includes tests, which involve the creation of human embryos. I assume that you include that process, given that it is the early stage process of cloning as part of this motion. But secondly, in a context in which therapeutic cloning, as you want to have happen, is being researched, very quickly your costs and your unsafety points will be reduced, which means that all of the arguments you attach to those are likely to fade away. And importantly, let's talk then about your argument about a black market. I'm going to talk about the proper application of the term black market, which is when you move research to other areas. But to be simple on this, if it is true that only wealthy people are able to afford it, that makes poor people feel bad because it is their dream, that implies that a lot of people would want to do this for genuine reasons that should be celebrated, but the poor are only able to access at the point at which the rich have already invested the early stage capital. That's how all forms of development work. That's like, your argument is like banning cell phones back in the 90s. They were very expensive only, I don't know if they were around in the 90s or not, but in the 90s, because they could only be developed in that context when rich people could access them. That's how luxury goods transition into regular parts of the mainstream economy. Finally, your argument about not all twins. You finally do identify something different about twins. That is the idea about the fact they come after someone else, and so they're likely to be compared to another person. So I think that's true in a lot of contexts already. For instance, we allow people with very famous fathers whose last name is likely to follow them around, and that seems analogous. Point is, I think that I agree, cloning is a little bit of a different sort of lifestyle. Is it so different that we would allow it to happen to a person who realistically would we allow it to violate the rights of parents to make choices on behalf of their kids? I want to ask you a question now. Why do you think parents would do this? Because in a context in which the child is very likely to be sick, or in a context in which it's incredibly expensive, and in a context in which parents can adopt and get IVF and stuff like that, why is a ban necessary? It seems to me that no one would do this in the first instance, and so a ban is not necessary. We can continue the research, and then at the point when it's easy, you're able to do it, none of your harms apply. We don't, the ban that you want to put on research to make sure the early stage never happens won't have kicked in and has happened here. I want to give one possible answer, which is that for a huge number of people, it's incredibly important for them in their relationship that they have a child that is biologically theirs, or at least one of theirs. But for a lot of people in those relationships, they also have genetic disorders that mean that it is very dangerous for them to have their own biological child. I think we should be very sympathetic to this stakeholder, because that's a relationship in one person is very ill and they both have the very good intention of wanting a child. And I think it is very, very morally wrong for the government to say that they should not be able to adjudicate for themselves that a clone is a better context in which to raise a child.
Going back to the top on the therapeutic cloning argument, one, he says that this research is mandatory for that to happen. One, I'm not banning the actual research of human cloning. I'm just banning the actual cloning itself. Like there's cloning research going on currently, like with the sheep and with the animals. So this cloning research can still exist without there being the human cloning to actually happen. Therefore, there's no link to that argument to actually happen. And two, he's only talking about cloning organs, and that organ cloning research would not have to do a human cloning research. If it would, and you have to clone the whole human to get the organ, then he links into everything, and then we don't see that being existent today. Two, he goes into the cost and the unsafety also decrease argument that we've continued to have. One, look to the cancer study of how cancer research and cancer treatment has not gotten cheaper, and it's still currently 75% of people are not able to get the top-notch treatment for that to be able to happen. That's a real-life scenario that we can actually judge this and look at this to actually being able to happen here. That's going to play heavily into this debate. Two, we go to the wealthy. He goes into this luxury tax, and when he talks about cell phones, one, cell phones are a good, not a treatment, so those really don't apply in this specific scenario. The good is not the same as the treatment. We're talking about the actual cloning and the medical process of what that specifically happens here. So we're going to see that only the wealthy can get that. And he's like, what's the big deal? It helps bring in the mainstream of that. One, again, you're going to link back to the cancer research about how this is not happening. And we only see the wealthy are getting the top of the line cancer research. Therefore, we're still going to have the impacts that come off of this of people not being able to afford and do this to be able to happen. So we're still going to see that continue to play into effect. And this black market scenario, this quality of life for this lower people that aren't able to achieve what he thinks is great, being able to come into play. Three, we're going to get onto this third contention. Which is very big. And he goes on to the clans. One, he talks about famous fathers. Two, a lot of famous children try to separate themselves from their fathers. And those that have gone down their line disagree with that. So we actually are going to see that that's a turn. A lot of people don't want to be just like their dad. My dad was a football coach. I wanted to be a debater. So he was a football coach at my high school. So that was turmoil, things that I had to go by living in my father's footsteps that actually hurt me throughout the long line because I did one lap around the football field and ran into the theater. Three, we're going to go into this also can be a turn against it where he's saying that why do people want to do this? One, my first argumentation on this is going to be that there's other ways to have genetic children without cloning. You can look to host mothers and different plannings of things and mixing of that. That's not actual cloning of the DNA itself. It's freezing of eggs and mixing and different things for that to work. There's other routes that don't have the risks that you see in my contention, one. So that argument is non-unique to this debate. And two, a lot of parents would do it just because it's the newest thing. Just like his cell phone arguments. Everybody's talking about the iPhone X because it's new. If cloning becomes legal, people do it, not realizing the impacts that happen in contention one and don't realize the situation that they've got in until after they have.
To start at the end, I think that you do not explain why a parent would want to do this beyond claiming that it is a fad. I think, in fact, parents are very conservative when they think about their children. Look at how many people look like new medicine and stuff like that and really want to reject that stuff for their children. That's much more common than in the mainstream community. And this is about the creation of life in the first instance. But also, by your characterization, it's still pretty dangerous right now. So I don't think that's plausible. But importantly, if there are some parents who are making the choice unwisely, there must be a far larger number, given that bringing a child into the world is an incredibly serious process, who are doing this incredibly seriously and making a choice really good consideration. No, you don't respond to my argument about the genetic abnormalities of parents who are not able to have children that carry their own genes. Those parents might not want to have the genes of another person injected, might not want to have the like IVF with a random sperm donor or something like that, but want to have a child that is uniquely theirs and as a result clone that person. The next thing to look at is whether or not this clone is in fact so different. Okay, you have identified some ways in which being a clone might be worse than bringing people into the world normally in some contexts. I think parents are easily able to anticipate those things and so are unlikely to do this unless in a circumstance in which it leads to things clearly being better. But also, notice that all of your arguments about how they're followed by their famous fathers or they want to get out of their shadows or anything like that, those are all things that you're able to distance yourself from, right? Like once you grow up and go into the real world, no one needs to know that you're a clone if you don't want them to. You can forge your own path. Just because you have different genetic materials doesn't mean that you need to publicize that to everyone. So I don't think it's sufficiently different that we should infringe on the rights of parents. Finally, on therapeutic cloning. You missed the link here. In order for therapeutic cloning to be properly researched, realistically, you need to do research which involves cloning embryos and which will then eventually develop into fetuses. And you actually need to go quite far along in that process and generate a relatively large number of abortions, frankly, before you're able to get therapeutic clonings. Now, on the balance of life, that's worth it, because when the technology eventually works out, it's going to be enormously effective. But you need to clone a little bit to do that. But even if you don't, at the point at which you've got therapeutic cloning, a much more complex and difficult process, and you're able to generate reliably safe organs with it, that is the context at which your first two contentions do not stand, because it has happened. I've repeated this point many, many times, and I do not intend to repeat it again. Finally, on your point about the self-esteem of the poor, maybe a question to ask here is, would you ban IVF? Because it's a luxury good, and a lot of people who are poor cannot afford to have a child but for anything else but IVF. The state subsidizes it to a limited degree, and potentially there's room to discuss that. But that implies the same thing. And the reason I think we don't do that is, firstly, because feelings are probably not enough of a justification to limit technology for anyone. But secondly, we want to allow the market to develop that stuff.
Okay, so I'm going to quickly brief on something, and this was a completely new argument for him to throw at me with all this abortion argument in my last speech, but I'm going to try to attack it really quickly here. One, he says the balance of life is worth it. One, my argumentation on that is no, it's not, because one, the balance of life has not been proven to be worth it when you look to my contention one. My contention one says 75% are done with abnormality. In a balance of life, we're aborting fetuses and doing different things to be able to have something that right now, over 15 years of research, hasn't been able to be proved to happen. When is enough for that to be able to happen? That is a complete turn against his case. I completely disagree with therapeutic research if we have to completely have the abortion of children for that to happen. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because I don't think that was brought up in the late end. But two, he says that the therapeutic research continues to go. Cancer research completely non-touched. 3 reasons we're going to vote pro. One, there's no advantages coming off of the Khan case. Like, all he says is this moral situation that we need to do. But when we look to the weighing of the advantages, because the Khan never really presented the case, he only refuted mine. So he has no counterplan or anything that can exist. It's just that we should have human cloning. That's basically all he's going for. With that, you're going to look to contention one and see how it's not successful. It creates abnormalities and actually decreases the quality of life because they're not living a normal life. They're living a life that fills abnormalities without the clone. Two, the therapeutic research that he gives on this argumentation does not play because the therapeutic research he's already said is going to have to lead to this even more. And he gives no therapeutic evidence, no link as to how much good this is going to do. So if you weigh it on a scale, my contention one outweighs heavily because he never really links the therapeutic evidence and impacts what good that can bring into what quantitative state. For him to bring that up in his last speech would be wrong because I can't answer it. Contention, the second reason, the impacts coming off of my case. Look to the abnormalities in my contention one. Look to the black market and the decrease of the quality of life for the poor in my contention two. And then look to the quality of life for the clone itself. My whole individuality versus different things, that doesn't happen. My argumentation that I answered about how we don't want to live in parents' shadows, how that could hurt us in the long run, and for that to happen. And then the three, the main contention you're going to vote for this is we can't achieve what the Khan wants. It's too expensive. The cancer research goes on. So any impacts or anything he claims coming off of this is never achievable. The cancer research argument, I know I keep going back to that, but that is key in this round. He has not been able to refute that. So I show how 75% of people cannot still afford the proper amount of cancer research that is required for them today. After all of this time, there's no way he can prove that human cloning is going to exist also. And then two, I want to go into this children argument that he made at the very beginning just to kind of go. One, this isn't a child, it's a clone. This is not the same thing in the same scenario, and we can't be raised just as that. It is the identical of one certain else that was created biologically, so those things don't link.
To begin with your thing about cancer, because you seem to be deeply pessimistic about the state of human cloning. But cancer research is a good example for our side because while cancer research hasn't decreased in cost, it has increased in effectiveness, and it has been happening over time. And then the second strategy that you use to get around this is just to misunderstand how complex technologies like cloning are. You say it's been 15 years and we haven't been able to make it work, but that is a pittance of time when we talk about the ability to be safely manipulating human genomes. We absolutely should continue with its manipulation. Secondly, on therapeutic cloning, I'm sorry I brought that out a bit late. I thought that that was something that we all knew in this debate and wasn't exactly a novel claim. Therapeutic cloning is going, and the reason I think you concede it immediately, is going to have enormous benefits for everyone in the world because it means that organ transplants are not dangerous anymore. And that's the thing that I told you right at the start as to why I thought that was an important difference to do. The backpedal there, because it involves a trade-off in terms of early stage abortions happening fairly regularly in the research policy, is telling here he wants to abandon that benefit that I told you about right at the start. He then lies and says that we don't have any benefits. Applied and very powerful benefit in this debate, which is that parents are able to make good choices on behalf of their children. He never answers the question why parents are making this choice irrationally. He just tells you that it's a choice that some parents would make badly. If all of his arguments are true, not many parents will do this. And the only context in which they're doing it are the ones that I've told you about, when it's a good choice. When you want to have a child, but one of your parents has a desperately bad genetic abnormality and you don't want to pass that on or risk passing that on to your child. And importantly, all of his arguments about individuality are not sufficiently different from the things that are already true about children right now. They already live in their parents' shadows. They're already brought up with their the knowledge they've brought into the world by a specific thing. The process of IVF, deliberate creation outside of normal sex, already raises questions about human life, and we already find all of that acceptable. And you do nothing to demonstrate that it's different, except that the mechanism of creation is different. But I don't think that is morally significant enough to incur the final harm of this debate, which is stripping parents of an important and deep right to manipulate their own genetic material and then replicate themselves through the world in a way that we already do, in the sense that we allow all people with no restriction, no matter how bad they'd be at it or how much the child would suffer, to bring a child into the world. The cost argument and the unsafety argument were brought out because he still supported research that would lower those costs. And we all knew those costs would go down, and cancer is a good example for that, not a bad